The Oversight and Government Reform Committee will come to order. The committee meets today to consider H.R. 2860, the OPM-IG Act, H.R. 3345, the Suspend Act, H.R. 3316, the Grant Act, and H.R. 3343 to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to clarify the rules regarding the determination of compensation of the Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. Quite a catchy phrase. The committee will now consider H.R. 2860, the OPM-IG Act, and the clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2860, a bill to amend Title V United States Code to provide that the Inspector General of the Office of Personnel Management may use amounts in the revolving fund of the office to fund audits, investigations, and oversight activities and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 2860 will be considered as read and open to amendments at any point. The text has already been distributed. It is in each of your folders. I'll now recognize myself for a short opening statement. H.R. 2860 responds to OPM Inspector General's call for increased oversight of OPM's revolving fund by providing the IG access to a portion of the revolving fund monies for oversight. H.R. 2860 recognizes oversight as a legitimate business cost and will help the IG respond to the increased referrals of alleged fraud within OPM's revolving fund, including in the background investigations used to determine an individual's eligibility for a security clearance. And with that, I would recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Federal Workforce Subcommittee Chairman Farenthold and Ranking Member Lynch for their work on this important piece of legislation. H.R. 2860 would give the Inspector General of the Office of Personnel Management the critical funding he needs from OPM's revolving fund to do necessary audits and investigations of this fund. OPM's $2 billion revolving fund finances such activities as the Federal Government's background investigations, training programs, USA Jobs. This legislation would remedy the gap in the current law which prevents this $2 billion fund from paying for the cost of the OPM Inspector General to properly oversee the revolving fund's activities. Subcommittee Chairman Farenthold and Ranking Member Lynch held a hearing on OPM's revolving fund this past June. Among other things, the OPM Inspector General testified on the significant concerns he had about the quality of background investigations. Most recently, the Edward Snowden incident and the Navy Yard shooting have demonstrated the need for thorough oversight of the Federal Government's background investigation and security clearance process. The OPM Inspector General plays a vital role in ensuring that the background investigations used to determine whether individuals should be trusted with our government's classified and sensitive information are properly conducted. This legislation would give the OPM Inspector General the resources he needs to conduct the necessary oversight of our nation's background investigations process. The Senate has already passed a substantially similar bill, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting 2860. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize that we have a bipartisan bill here and would like to recognize the authors for short opening statements. Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me to speak on the OPM-IG Act. The OPM serves as a regulator for rules affecting the management of Federal workers, but it's also involved into a fee-based service provider that provides billions of dollars of service each year to the very same agencies governed by the OPM's management rules. The revolving budget fund has grown from $191 million in fiscal year 1998 to more than $2 billion today. OPM's revolving fund budget is almost 91% of OPM's estimated funding for the current fiscal year, yet the resources available to the IG for audit of that fund have not kept pace. For more than 30 years, both the GAO and OPM Inspectors General have been concerned about the management resources in the revolving fund. Each has issued a number of reports and audits examining various and often recurring problems. The OPM Inspector General has investigated a number of cases involving the falsification of background investigations, including reporting of investigations that never occurred, recording answers to questions that were never asked, and document records checks that were never conducted. Within the military departments, 81% 20% of OPM's customer base. These cases have serious national security implications. Inspector General McFarland has testified before the Federal Workforce Subcommittee in June, stating that the OPM revolving fund program, and I'm quoting now, have been operating in the shadows for far too long, end quote. He also added that sunshine, as we say in this committee, is the best disinfectant. The bill allows the OPM IG to use part of the revolving fund to pay for the audits of that fund and investigations. The IG's resources would be limited to 1/3 of 1% of the revolving fund budget, and the IG would be required to submit an annual budget request and working details as part of its revolving fund oversight work. It provides the resources for critical oversights at relatively low cost, and most importantly, using existing funds. And I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill.
And we now recognize the co-sponsor of the bill, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the Ranking Member for his kind words, and especially my thanks to the Federal Workforce Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Farenthold from Texas, for working together with me and our staffs on sponsoring this critically important bipartisan legislation. As has been noted, H.R. 2860, the Office of Personnel Management Inspector General Act, would give the Inspector General of the Office of Personnel Management the authority to obtain the funding necessary to conduct comprehensive audits and investigations of the Office of Personnel Management's revolving fund operations. I thank the OPM Inspector General, Patrick McFarland, for bringing to our attention the need for this legislation during a Federal Workforce Subcommittee hearing this past June on the revolving fund. During that hearing, the Inspector General testified that he was being hampered in his efforts to properly oversee OPM's revolving fund programs, which include background investigations, which has been noted earlier, and human resource training activities. Under the current law, Inspector General's oversight costs are not permitted to be charged against the revolving fund, and consequently the Inspector General had available only about 12% of the funding that he would normally have access to during the fiscal year 2013 in that budget to conduct oversight of OPM's revolving fund and other non-trust fund programs. This bill, H.R. 2860, would allow the Inspector General's oversight costs to be charged against the revolving fund, just as the program costs are charged to OPM's retirement and health care trust funds. The OPM Inspector General has expressed concern that he lacks the resources to properly investigate falsification of background investigations and related quality compliance issues. In addition, the revolving fund has never been audited in its entirety, which is a problem, and the Inspector General has identified areas of high risk in OPM's revolving fund activities that could benefit from thorough audits. The recent incidents regarding Edward Snowden and Aaron Alexis have confirmed the OPM's Inspector General's concerns about the Federal Government's process for investigating individuals for security clearances. And we need to reexamine the Federal Government's background investigation process and determine whether reforms are necessary. It is vital that we provide the OPM Inspector General with the funding and resources he needs to assist us in our review and oversight of a process that implicates national security. This bill would give the OPM Inspector General access to about, as Mr. Farenthold has noted, about 1/3 of 1% of OPM's annual revolving fund budget. With the current revolving fund budget of $2 billion, the Inspector General would have authority to receive up to a maximum of $6.6 million to fund related oversight costs. This is a sound and wise investment. The OPM Inspector General gives the Federal Government and our taxpayers a return on investment of $7 for each oversight dollar spent. However, the importance of preventing or mitigating national security risks, as in the Snowden and the Navy Yard shooter case, are immeasurable. Lastly, let me note that the Administration and our colleagues in the other chamber also recognize the significance of this legislation. This proposal was included in the President's fiscal year 2014 budget request, and the President passed by unanimous consent substantially similar legislation earlier this month. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join Mr. Farenthold and myself in supporting H.R. 2860, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I will hold open the record until the end of the day, so any member who would like to submit a written statement may. Does any member wish to speak on the bill further? Does any member wish to offer an amendment? If there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 2860 to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 2860 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. H.R. 2860, the OPM-IG Act, is ordered reported to the House. The committee will now consider H.R. 3343 to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to clarify the rules regarding the determination of compensation of the Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. The Clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 3343, a bill to amend the District of Columbia Home Rule Act to clarify the rules regarding the determination of the compensation of the Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia.
Didn't I just say that? Without objection, H.R. 3343 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. And I'll briefly explain the history and the reason for this bill. First of all, I'd like to thank Eleanor Holmes Norton for tirelessly working, even during the shutdown, to get this ready to happen. As many people can understand, the Federal Government is not at the high end going to be the highest paid employer. This committee over the years has looked at pay for special cases, top scientists, analysts at the Security Exchange Commission and others, and realized that in some cases pay greater than the Vice President of the United States may be appropriate. University presidents and others routinely in the private sector make more than the President of the United States. However, in the unique case of the Chief Financial Officer for the District of Columbia, this committee has a special role. In the 1990s, when the District of Columbia was bankrupt, Congress, at the direction of this committee, stepped in with a sweeping legislation to help right the city's sinking fiscal ship. Included in the reform was the establishment of an independent Chief Financial Officer to oversee the city's finances. The city is now vetting a candidate to replace the long-standing CFO, Dr. Gandhi. These are big shoes to fill at the city, and the City Council and the Mayor are seeking the latitude to increase the salary a small amount to find an appropriate successor. In many cases, the amount that we will consider today will still be less than candidates could make in the competing market with cities, counties, and the like. The bill before us today does, though, if you will, harmonize the CFO's pay with other members of the Federal Government's senior executive service. In other words, there are already senior executives heading agencies, often with smaller budgets than the District of Columbia, who are receiving the compensation that the CFO candidate will be offered. Many Federal agencies already have this, as I said, and we know that at a minimum we should offer the kinds of pay that agency individuals, CFOs, if you will, within government already receive. For that reason, I urge all our members to support this reform and recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I want to yield to Ms. Norton, who's worked so hard on this legislation. I yield to her.
I thank the Ranking Member for yielding and for all of his assistance. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for getting this bill on this markup in a timely fashion when we approached you late, and understanding the importance and the urgency of it. And speaking of shutdowns, Mr. Chairman, may I thank you for your extraordinary help during the shutdown when the District of Columbia was not able to spend its own local funds, and your help was really indispensable, and especially in getting our local fund budget out for the entire fiscal year. Mr. Chairman, you have explained the bill very well. I will only briefly add to what you've said. The CFO who has testified before you, Dr. Gandhi, is retiring after 13 years, and you worked with me to find an appropriate standard, and a standard that Federal officials that this committee and that the Congress would understand for the new salary for the CFO. An excellent candidate has apparently been found, and the salary that is consistent with the senior executive service salaries does seem to me to be entirely appropriate. This is a unique official in the United States. Nowhere else in the country is there an unelected official who cannot be fired except for cause, excuse me, who essentially gets to decide when funds may be obligated and expended. The search revealed a CFO from Arizona. The search committee was headed by Alice Rivlin, who happens to be a resident of the District of Columbia. She, of course, not only headed our own Financial Control Board, but we know her on the Hill because of her work as head of the OMB and the Congressional Budget Office, where she was the first head of the CBO. She and Mayor Anthony Williams led the search, and it is they who determined that some small increase in salary was appropriate, especially since this CFO is coming from Arizona, where apparently the cost of living is considerably less than in this region, in this city. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for all you've done to help me with all these matters involving the District of Columbia and its efficiency, and particularly I appreciate your getting this matter on your markup today.
I thank the gentlelady. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day for anyone else who wants to give an opening statement. Does any member wish to offer an amendment to this perfect and well-written piece of legislation? If there's no further discussion, I move
Mr. Chairman, would you allow a comment?
If the gentlelady from the District of Columbia wants to recognize you. Do you know this man? The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the Chair. I want to thank the Chair for his leadership on District of Columbia issues. I really appreciate it. As somebody who represents, and of course Ms. Norton's leadership and the ranking members' unwavering support, you know, as somebody who helped run one of the largest local governments in the United States for 5 years, it has always puzzled me, being in the shadow of the nation's capital, that we continue to insist that the District of Columbia ought not to be run as an independent municipality, but actually be run under the control and thumb of the Congress. I support this legislation. I wish it weren't necessary. I wish the District of Columbia had the autonomy any other municipality or locality in the United States has. So I thank all for their leadership in this matter, and I just hope someday we can arrive at the point where we trust the District of Columbia to determine its own fate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the term baby steps comes to mind as we little by little whittle away some of the legacy of the past relative to oversight of the city. If there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 3343 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3343 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion agreed to. H.R. 3343 is ordered reported to the House. The committee will now consider H.R. 3316, the Grant Act. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 3316, a bill to amend Title 31 United States Code to provide transparency and require certain standards in the award of Federal grants and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 3316 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize myself for a short opening statement. The Grant Act achieves greater transparency and accountability in Federal grant process. In fact, its common sense reforms led the bill to be reported out of this committee by a voice vote in the last Congress. Indeed, one of the hallmark pieces of legislation passed on a bipartisan basis by this committee is, in fact, the Grant Act. The need for this legislation is clear. From 1990 to 2012, grant spending grew to over $600 billion, or nearly one-fifth of the Federal budget. Tens of billions of dollars are spent each year on discretionary grants as opposed to State or formula grants. Identifying and reducing vulnerabilities in the awarding of and administration of grant programs is critical to ensure that our government is being responsible as possible to taxpayers. In an era of post-earmarks, where Congress often determined effectively grants, it seems only appropriate that the $600 billion worth of earmarks be equally scrutinized as the executive branch tries to spend money on a meritorious basis. While agencies often employ and form a competitive or merit-based procedures in awarding grants, the process used by agencies lacks the basic transparency needed. Laws creating grant programs often give agencies wide latitude in how they choose to distribute discretionary grant funds. In some cases, an agency's decision-maker will have virtually unilateral and unchecked discretion. The Grant Act remedies this situation by providing a basic framework of discretionary grants, shining a light on the often impenetrably opaque grant process. Furthermore, it is an unsuccessful grant applicant may never learn why his proposal was not funded. I think the most important part of this bill is, in fact, for grant recipients in the vast majority of grants to have an understanding why their grant didn't occur. The meritoriousness of a grant should not be based on some unknown piece of how you write a successful grant. For that reason, such decisions that are often unexplained and undocumented represent a failure to improve the process, to cause people to write equally well and thus have the determination of a grant be awarded based on merit rather than who you hired to write your grant. The bill gives grantees more tools to better compete for Federal funding and ensures grantors be held accountable for their funding decisions. Enactment of the Grant Act will result in grant funds being allocated more efficiently, free of improper influence, and ultimately that will help our tax dollars go further. The American people ask us constantly for transparency. This is an example of where transparency can be added, and I want to particularly commend Mr. Lankford for introducing this legislation, holding hearings, and in fact bringing to us today a bill that is very bipartisan. With that, I recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I support the goals of the Grant Act, and I believe this bill is well-intentioned. Grant applicants deserve a fair and transparent process. The American people also deserve to know how their money is being spent. This bill, however, has some significant problems. Last Congress, Representative Connolly and I, as well as other members, raised concerns about some of these issues. The majority has made changes to the bill aimed at addressing those concerns. However, there are still several problems that need to be fixed. One serious issue that needs to be addressed before this bill moves forward is a provision that would require agencies to disclose the employer of every peer reviewer. Peer reviewers are used by agencies to help review grant applications and recommend which applicants should be awarded grants. It is imperative that these reviewers be unbiased. Exposing the identity of a reviewer could jeopardize the reviewer's ability to make decisions free from pressure or influence. I understand Representative Pocan will offer an amendment that would only require agencies to disclose a unique identifier for each peer reviewer rather than any information that could be used to expose their identity. I also understand that Mr. Connolly may offer an amendment to address some of the administrative burdens this bill could place on grant recipients. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we can work cooperatively and in a bipartisan fashion to improve the bill. It has good potential, but it needs these changes before it can become good law. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I look forward to making this bill mutually acceptable to all or as many parties as possible. I'll hold the record open for additional opening statements. Does any member wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Lankford?
I would, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do believe the GRANT Act is one of those pieces of the puzzle that can make a difference and increase our transparency. It improves the way that Federal grant funds are distributed and how they're accounted for. We've worked with many stakeholders, including university groups, transparency organizations, and reviewed previously given and all kinds of reviews that have previously been given to try to strengthen this legislation from what we had considered in the previous Congress. The bill focuses primarily on discretionary competitive grants. I want to make that clear. In other words, grants through which the agencies quite literally transfer tax dollars at their discretion to projects that the agency deems deserving. The bill ensures that the agencies are authorized to do this have the basic procedures in place to ensure fairness in the process. Now, most agencies do have really good procedures in place on this. Some of them do not. The bill doesn't prescribe procedures that have to be in place, but it instead leaves that to each agency, since each agency knows its programs and has its authorities and can manage those best. The mechanism for accountability the bill employs is transparency and openness. Currently, agencies can award discretionary grants to whomever they wish, and it's very difficult for anyone to question them about that or for us to get information. These are tax dollars that we are held to account for, that we should have some ability to be able to inspect how the decision is being made on that. Moreover, the public has a right to know how their money is being spent. To that end, the bill requires agencies to post to a central government-wide website information about upcoming grant opportunities and about the outcome of every grant competition, to include the posting of successful grant proposals or an abstract if the agency deems that more appropriate, as well as the reasons supporting the selection of the successful grantees. Upon completion of the grant, the bill would require that agencies post the final report or results of the grant for the benefit of future research for the American public. The bill does not require agencies to post any information that is exempt under the Freedom of Information Act. We want to be able to protect researchers and those institutions. We'll continue to protect academic freedom and innovation coming out of our country's excellence universities and other locations that receive grants, knowing that not all grants are just scientific grants. We have grants to deal with justice. We have grants to deal with education. The bill adds two other measures as well to improve the grant-making process and to promote transparency. First, the bill requires agencies to screen potential grantees to make sure they have the necessary financial systems in place and are capable of actually performing the grant. There's no entitlement to a discretionary competitive grant. Screening out grantees that are not capable of carrying out the grant will reduce wasteful or wrong uses of funds during the performance of the grant. Second, the bill promotes transparency and open decision-making by providing disappointed applicants of grants of more than $100,000 with an opportunity for a debrief, in which the agency will inform the entity why it made the decisions or all those decisions that it made. If our grant process will be fair, it must provide opportunities for losing applicants to learn and improve. This bill is designed to ensure that agencies have a fair and open process in spending grant funds. It should also help all applicants for grants, both the large and small institutions. The more time a grantee has to decide if it should prepare a proposal, the better chance it will have to successfully compete. A smaller entity will have to choose between different projects and its limited resources. If a prospective grantee has an idea of where the agency may be going months in advance, it will be better positioned to compete. We have attempted to craft this bill in a way that will allow all agencies, regardless of their mission, to implement the measures without undue disruption to their operations, our national security, our national economic development, and academic competitiveness. I hope that members will support this bill today, and I look forward to the conversation about it. With that, I yield back, sir.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
If you'll hold for just a moment. If there's no further request, I'll hold the Pardon me? I just want to get her amendment. Oh. Anyone wish to offer an amendment? The gentlelady is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment. And for those who think they missed their chance, amendments you get 5 minutes on too. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3316, offered by Ms. Spear of California.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. One of the purposes of this bill is to minimize the burden on grant applicants that have received substantial grants in the past. And I agree that we should not be reinventing the wheel every time they apply. I understand Mr. Lankford, the author of the bill, was trying to create a more certain definition of covered applicant that would be accepted from some filing requirements. But I do think that it unintentionally may have gone too far in setting a 10-year window. So this amendment simply says that to qualify as a covered applicant, the applicant has to have more than $10 million in grants and has completed at least one in the past 3 years, as opposed to just one that has more than $10 million in grants in the past 10 years. This ensures that we can reduce the burden on those who have a reliable track record on applying for, receiving, and performing on grants, but we are also being cognizant that we need to ensure that we don't allow those whose situations may have changed to benefit to the expense of more qualified new applicants. I'd like to thank Mr. Lankford for working with me on this small change to ensure that the process is as simple as possible and still protect the integrity of it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you. And I do thank the gentlelady for getting a chance to work through this. There's always areas that we can improve, and watch the original version of this, having received a Federal grant in the previous 3 years. I think that the gentlelady has improved that even with completed a Federal grant in the previous 3 years. That simple change allows us to have some sort of check that to note that the financial systems were done. They turned their paperwork in on time. They did a good job with it. Once it's completed, there is a measure to be able to check it. I would have no opposition to this amendment. Be glad to be to receive an improvement to the bill.
Would the gentleman yield to the gentleman from Florida?
Absolutely.
To the amendment, I do support the amendment. It will be an improvement. To the bill, let me just say very briefly that having reviewed some of this discretionary grant process, we award hundreds of billions of dollars in Federal grants, discretionary grants, with little or no information. These hundreds of billions of dollars of discretionary grants are granted in the dark. And I'm very pleased to support the underlying legislation and urge its passage with this amendment so that we can shed some light coming from the Florida State. We have sunshine laws, and I think this has the potential for being a great sunshine light bill on discretionary grants and take these grants that have been awarded in the dark into the light of day with public review. Additional information for everyone is always helpful. I yield back.
Would the gentleman further yield to the gentleman from Georgia?
I absolutely would, sir.
No? You're good. Okay. The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Georgia.
Move strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate Mr. Lankford's work on this, and transparency and openness is something that is hallmarks of, I think, what we need to have in Congress and what we've been working on. And I also want to appreciate Mr. Lankford's willingness to work with Mr. Woodall and I on some other issues that we've had come up. We still want to make sure that this is open and transparent, but also at the same time protecting the intellectual property aspects and other aspects, especially in our university systems and others. And I just want to say I thank you for your willingness to work on this and your hard work. Mr. Woodall and I have expressed that, and just wanted to make that on the public record. And as this moves forward, I believe this is exactly what we need to be doing in government, keeping transparency, making sure it's an open process so that our people can know that they can entrust the dollars that we use and spend wisely. And I just want to commend the gentleman for his efforts on this, and with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
The gentleman yields.
This is an unfinished project.
Exactly.
I'm extremely aware of that. As we have run this through the previous Congress, had a lot of input from a lot of different institutions. We're grateful for the input of those institutions because we want to be able to help, not hurt, in the process. So as we work this bill through today and the amendments today, and then I would assume we'd have amendments on the floor as well, continue to work through the process, do any kind of correcting language to make sure we get this right. I'm very open to input on that, as the gentleman knows well, and grateful for the encouragement in that. So I yield back.
And reclaiming my time, and I just appreciate the work that you have put in. This is the way this is supposed to work, and I do appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does anyone else wish to offer an amendment? The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment. The amendment is not at the desk. Does the gentleman have an amendment to offer to the desk?
Yes.
It is coming. Hot off the presses. And could you distribute that to folks at the dais, please? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to
Or read the
HR
amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3316, offered by Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman is recognized for purpose of explaining his amendment.
I thank the Chair. And let me first begin by thanking Mr. Langford for his passion on the subject. I know this is something near and dear to his heart. We worked in the last Congress to try to find something that would meet some of the concerns that are raised, and I know that he's made changes to this bill, and I appreciate his willingness to do so. My amendment represents a fairly straightforward compromise to enable us to address the concerns raised by the academic community, and I listened carefully to our colleague from Georgia just now about concerns raised in his academic community as well, and the scientific research institutions and agencies. As the sponsor of this legislation certainly is aware, the Association of American Universities, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the Council on Government Relations, three organizations that represent premier U.S. research institutions, have some concerns still about the potential inadvertent harm the Grant Act could inflict on scientific research and innovation systems. I continue to share those concerns as somebody who represents a high-tech district with very active and vibrant academic research institutions. Particularly the Act's requirement that the grant application, grant performance information, and executed grant agreement for all awarded grants be posted online. That could lead to the release of unprotected intellectual property to competitors, could facilitate possible misuse of information, especially with respect to dual-use research, and release sensitive information about researchers and facilities conducting sensitive types of research. That's why I'm proposing this amendment to replace the requirement for full grant applications with a requirement that grant abstracts be posted. This would still protect the public interest by requiring agencies to explain how they are using taxpayer money, but would do so in a way that would protect the intellectual property concerns and propriety concerns that have been raised. I note with interest, Mr. Chairman, that in the last Congress we actually had a letter from our colleagues from Iowa, Stephen King and Tom Latham, expressing similar concerns on behalf of their universities. I have a letter from George Mason University in Northern Virginia raising this concern and supporting my amendment dated October 28th, and without objection it asks to be entered into the record. And with that, I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
Let me ask you just a question. Assuming this does not pass here in committee, would the gentleman be willing to narrow his amendment for the floor so that we might, assuming it doesn't, be able to have one in which the bias or the rights of the university shall be appropriately considered, and perhaps even a second look at it if it's denied by the agency? Because one of the challenges we have, and I know the ranking member shares this, is universities, as you said, are concerned that they might have information released. The current law, or the current bill, does allow the agencies to redact or eliminate, certainly the universities be consulted. So it seems like it's a question of trust of the agencies and a bias toward, is the university given a full and complete hearing, that I think I hear the gentleman asking for as an amendment?
I think that the Chairman is correct, and I certainly would be willing to work with him and Mr. Langford to try to come up with something. We tried to do that, unfortunately, unsuccessfully in the last Congress. I would just say this, because the Chairman makes a really good point. Essentially, what we're doing here is, and Mr. Langford correctly pointed out, discretion still exists to allow the abstract rather than the full posting, but the default is on the full posting. That is what is of concern. What can go wrong with that when you're talking so many grants, so many institutions? And so if we could work on some language that tries to address that concern and ameliorate that concern, certainly then I could find myself, and I think some of our other colleagues, supportive of the legislation. Absent that, our concern is such that this is a hard bill to support. So the Chairman makes a very good point, and if there's a way we can try to do this. The concern I raised today, as the Chairman well knows, is not a new concern for me. It's one we did discuss when we last marked this up.
Well, let me, if the gentleman further yields.
Of course.
Because we're going to roll any request for recorded votes, I'd like to let the debate go forward on this amendment. At the conclusion of debate, if the gentleman is satisfied and wants to work further on it, he can withdraw. If not, we could still continue working until the end of this sequence to see if an agreement to make something happen before the floor. And certainly, I would move that I would support your, if you don't take a recorded vote here, I would support that it be placed in order on the floor so that you not be denied that second opportunity. But my hope is that we can find some common sense middle ground that, whenever possible, makes the full bill available, but protects rights for either all or some of the information. And I know Mr. Lankford has studied this in more detail, but I've always felt that one of the challenges is somewhere between everything and an abstract lies middle ground with some redaction, and I think that may be what you could work on behalf of universities.
Mr. Chairman, with your assurance that we would, between now and when and if this came to the floor, be able to work on some hopefully mutually acceptable language, and failing that, your support for my right to try to have an amendment to the floor to try to address this, hopefully unnecessary, I would certainly accede to the Chairman's request.
I thank the gentleman. I should recognize the author of the bill for his input in this, Mr. Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the gentleman from Virginia, we have had this conversation before on it, and I do agree. There is a way to be able to resolve this. The struggle is, and I have some amazing research facilities that are in my district as well, that do incredible work, that they deal with proprietary information that's very important to be able to protect. But those are not all the grants that are out there. The Department of Education does grants. A grant about how you're requesting smart boards for your school district is not exactly intellectual property. But district after district applies for those, never receives those. They don't see the winning applications to know, how do I get this? So they continue to fill it out wrong every year without seeing a winning application or having a debrief of that I can get this. So trying to allow a more open process so that those that lose and lose every single year have an opportunity to be able to win some of these grants as well. Department of Commerce, the EPA, I mean, all these different entities do all these different grants that don't necessarily have intellectual property attached to it. We are actually working through with several of the institutions as well on language that is common nomenclature that has good definitions about enabling language is the term that's used, that there is enabling language that will allow someone that is a researcher to have enough information to be able to steal your intellectual property, then that's too far. That's a term, that's a common use term that may need to be included in this to help protect researchers so that enabling language doesn't get in, so allow that property to be stolen by international actors or even another institution before they can get that information complete. So I'd be glad to be able to work through this to make sure that we get it right. I don't want my research institutions hurt either in the process, but neither do I want some educator to not be able to get a grant just because somehow that's protected as intellectual property when it's a grant request for smart boards.
If my friend would yield?
Yes, I would.
I completely share his concern. And as I said, I understood from the beginning your concern, which I always thought was legitimate. The concern I have here, and the concern I had a year and a half ago, is the unintended consequence. I think the Chairman put his finger on that. So if we can use this time creatively one more time to try to see if we can narrow those differences so that there aren't those inadvertent consequences, I would very much appreciate working with my colleague and with the Chairman and the Ranking Member to try to achieve that.
I know for my part I'd be glad to do that.
I thank the Chair.
With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now recognize the delegate from the District of Columbia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think in many ways this is really an excellent provision, an excellent bill. But I disagree that intellectual property, the only intellectual property that we should be concerned about, and you cite the Department of Education as scientific information. This is a discretionary process, and therefore I understand and appreciate the need to make sure that it is done fairly, but it is also a competitive process. I certainly would wonder about the redaction. Seems to me one would have to have consultations with the author if you were to redact, and I really wonder if we want to go through all of that, adding the time, effort, and paperwork. I also fear that if we do not find a way to fix this important section, it will breed litigation on the one hand or chill applications on the other, and I think neither is the intent here. The respect for intellectual property of all kinds, yes, scientific, but across the board. If you are an academic, and I am one, if you're an academic, what you consider intellectual property, that could be used by another school or a competitor, runs very deep and very broad. Our country has the greatest innovators in the world, and we ought to be doing everything we can to both encourage these applications and to encourage others by being able to see what a successful application looks like, to also try. So I appreciate what is being undertaken here, and I'm sure that we can fix it.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Be glad to yield.
One of the things that's in the bill right now deals with FOIA. If it's FOIA-able material, Freedom of Information Act, if it's exempt from that already, it would already be pulled out. But there could also be an opportunity for the applicant themselves to be able to name this information I consider intellectual property, to highlight that, so the agency's not having to make that judgment call. The applicant could do that. There could be standard portions of it that must go out, but then the applicant themselves can say, this part I would really wish would not go public on it. That may be a way to be able to work this through agencies. I'm sure there's a way that we can protect them. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, if he still wants a vote, or would you like to delay that for now? We could wait on we could table the amendment until after Mr. Pohan's, if you'd like to do that.
I accede to the Chairman.
Okay. I'm sorry, the term technically must be postponed. We are not tabling. The gentleman chooses to postpone. Is there anyone else wishing to offer an amendment at this time? The gentleman is recognized for purposes of offering his amendment, Mr. Pocan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And the clerk will read the amendment.
Yeah,
amendment to H.R. 3316 offered by Mr. Pocan.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate the intent of Mr. Lankford's legislation. I have an amendment that I think would help make it better and address some of the concerns that we have from the academic community. I represent a district encompassing one of the largest university recipients of federal research funding, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which happens to be my alma mater as well as Mr. Jordan's. This funding is crucial to our country's continued innovation. The projects at UW-Madison range from copyright protection in the digital age to medical research to conducting research on our Great Lakes to participating in the recent discovery of the Higgs-like boson. Furthermore, according to the Association of American Universities, economists have indicated federal funding in university research has influenced approximately half of the economic growth over the last 50 years. A 2011 report by North Star Economics, Inc. estimated that research performed at UW-Madison alone accounted for 283 startup companies supporting 21,000 jobs and contributing approximately $2 billion to the economy. I know there are other wonderful research universities in the country, including in the districts of many of my colleagues here today, doing the same thing. The bill before us intends to improve the federal research grant process by setting standards and ensuring oversight of grants while increasing transparency in the application and awarding process. While I believe the government should be as open and transparent as possible, my fear is that in the current language, by removing anonymity from the peer review process, will lead to unintended consequences that could do more harm than good. Dr. Donna Polnick, Associate Dean of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Graduate School, said, "Preserving the anonymity of the peer reviewer is extremely important for maintaining a high-quality peer review process. We hope that the committee language will reflect this in consideration of the Grant Act or any similar legislation going forward." To that end, I feel my amendment, which seeks to protect anonymity in the peer review process, would maintain the intention of the overall legislation while addressing the potential for harmful outside meddling. Anonymity is important because it allows the peer review process to be independent and for great candor and honesty to be part of the process. While transparency is important, it's also important that this process remain free from outside influence. If it is clear who is making the decisions, there's no reason why potential recipients could not attempt to lobby the peer reviewers on their behalf. Furthermore, it's important to recruit the most reputable experts in a field for the peer review process. If the participants fear backlash for the peer review process, it will be difficult to recruit volunteers to serve as peer reviewers. This process must remain anonymous. My amendment seeks to maintain anonymity in the peer review process while still creating the transparency that this bill seeks. It uses a unique identifier for all peer reviewers, not their name or employer. Some disciplines are so small that a disclosure of the employer would, by default, identify the member of the peer review board. Using a unique identifier, the public would still be able to monitor how often each peer reviewer was participating in the process and question suspicious repetition. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the need for transparency, and I feel the unique identifier will provide a measure of transparency without disrupting the ability of reviewers to be objective in their decisions. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the gentleman, this is a tough issue for us, and this is one we've struggled with a lot. We want there to be greater transparency. We want there to be greater openness. I'll say one of the issues that we have in many of the grants is they tend to go to the same institutions over and over again. And when you ask the people that are turned down, they can always tell you who the peer reviewers are, and they happen to be graduates of that institution. And so institutions or groups of institutions or organizations tend to get more grants because the reviewers come from that institution as well, and they obviously trust them. I'm not saying it's just they're only going to go there, but they know it's going to be taken care of well because they're from there. And so they know how it's going to be taken care of. And other places are a risk. Well, that's a challenge if you're one of the other places that are scattered across the country that is also doing good research in other parts of the field. So there is a need to provide some greater openness in this. There's also a need to be able to protect the peer reviewer. I get that. What I'd like to do is to be able to work through a process on this that we felt like we've already done. For instance, one thing we put in there is the 6-month time period. That's not specific to this specific place, this specific grant. It's a group of grants that have happened over the last 6 months, so that they're not going to be as closely tied to it. Giving the agency the ability to be able to choose if they're going to do a unique identifier or not provides an agency for the opportunity. For instance, I would assume NIH and most of our research grants that are done, they're going to use unique identifiers. EPA, Department of Commerce, Education probably won't. I mean, it's not going to be as secure, though they would have that option if they wanted to do that. The second part of your amendment that strikes the disclosure of the grant reviewers, though, I do have a big problem with. That closes out a lot of transparency. That the peer reviewers will still have a unique identifier, but in some of the agencies, it has the appearance that a relatively small group of people make the final decision, regardless of what the peer reviewer does. It's one of the things we're trying to address. That occasionally peer reviewers will rank people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it gets into the agency doesn't like the peer review, and they actually choose 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, without giving a reason why they didn't choose the top 5. And somewhere in the bureaucracy, things changed, and no one knows why, and no one knows who they are. There needs to be some transparency in the process, that a small group of people without accountability can't be just caught up in the machine making decisions affecting billions of dollars, and no one can hold them to account. So what I'd like to do is be able to meet with the gentleman, if you'd be open to this, to be able to work through the process to find a way. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be adamant that there is some way to provide some openness, even if it is only a unique identifier, for instance, for the final reviewers, that there is some way to know, is it the same 2 people, because those 2 numbers come up every time, is it the same 2 people that make a decision every single time once it gets back in the agency? If so, why? Why isn't that spread out? What's done in the other review? In some way that we can continue to protect this in situations where it's not scientific research. Is that fair?
Yeah, if you'll yield, Mr.
Yes, I would.
You know exactly where you're going is a backup position that I was going to offer. If we could continue to work on this, I've had good experience with this committee working on amendments. We did the travel for Federal employees, and I'd be glad to continue working with you as we get to the floor on this, if you're open to that.
I'll reclaim my time. I'd be glad to. Again, I have great research institutions in my district as well. They share some of the same concerns, though as I've talked them through the process, they've seen the language, they're at ease with it from there, knowing what the language is with the 6-month time period and everything else, but other institutions may not have that same thing. And so glad to be able to work through the process, get as many people involved in this as we can.
Thank you.
So with that, I'd yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman withdraw? The gentleman withdraws his amendment. Mr. Cummings? Okay. You can strike the last word. Okay. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill or offer an amendment? Seeing none, the question reappears on the postponed vote on the gentleman from Virginia. Does the gentleman from Virginia still request a vote?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Pursuant to the rule, we will postpone that. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to do the voice vote, I'm being reminded. All those in favor of the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on the underlying bill. Would you like a recorded vote?
I would request.
You are the slowest at requesting that.
I just didn't want to interrupt the Chairman.
Now, there's a first. A recorded vote on this amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia pursuant to the rules will be postponed, as will the final vote on the bill. We now call up, without any further suspending of it, H.R. 3345, the Suspend Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3345, a bill to amend Title 31 United States Code to consolidate suspension and debarment offices and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 3345 will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. The Federal Government spends over $1 trillion annually in contract and grant awards. At a time of fiscal austerity and tight budgets, it has never been more important to ensure Federal dollars only go to responsible contractors and grantees. Despite intense congressional oversight in recent years, and most of it by this committee, the GAO has identified serious weaknesses in the suspension and debarment S&D programs of numerous agencies. For example, HHS, the largest agency in terms of combined contracts and grant spending at $363 billion a year, had a mere 2 suspensions or debarment actions in fiscal year FY 2012. This important legislation has been developed in a transparent and collaborative manner. We posted the draft of legislation in February, held full committee hearing in June, and posted an updated draft last Friday before introducing the bill yesterday. We received comments from numerous stakeholders, and much of their feedback is reflected in the legislation before you today. Among other reforms, this bill requires consistent use of show cause letters to ensure accused parties are heard prior to any adverse action being taken against them. It mandates a single government-wide case management system that tracks cases and makes publicly available all final resolutions in S&D cases. I might particularly mention that this consolidation began under then Chairman Davis, recognizing that government should look as one body when it looks at who are their vendors and not infinitely have different rules. This bill particularly consolidates more than 40 executive agencies, S&D offices, into one centralized board. Larger CFO Act agencies and military departments can continue to operate their own independent S&D offices if granted a waiver upon demonstration of effective S&D program. And I want to particularly highlight this. There are many agencies who are small and who, quite frankly, would welcome the opportunity not to be burdened with suspension and debarment. Some of these agencies have had complaints but have not done one suspension debarment. Other agencies, and particularly the Department of Defense, may very well look at its system and make the case that it is appropriate and unique for them to do it. But they will still do it under this reform under one consolidated oversight agency. I think this reform particularly is analogous to and successor to the reform put up by former Chairman Tom Davis, which resulted in the consolidation of 8 separate boards of contract appeals into one board. That reform was ultimately enacted as part of fiscal year 2006 NDAA. The Suspend Act requires standard procedures for expedited review to handle contract or grant fraud in a contingency or time-sensitive environment in both military and non-military settings. The stakes here are high. Federal suspension debarment programs are critical enablers that protect the integrity of our procurement and grant system. We can keep on, excuse me, we can keep doing it as we have been doing it, or we can improve the process by making it more transparent and accountable. I appreciate that the suspension debarment law is complicated and often arcane subject. I am grateful for all the feedback on this legislation we have received from outside experts. And I am particularly grateful that over the years, Ms. Speer, and I won't go on to everyone, but this has been very bipartisan. People have recognized that, in fact, this is the committee, more than any other committee, that sees contractors who contract for agencies we have no direct authority over, and yet we see that there is a failure in the process. Particularly, I think that this committee's special role over the Inspectors General recognizes that most of the requests for suspension debarment include an IG's recommendation, and as such, those recommendations being in an expeditious fashion recognized and used in the future can only benefit this committee's ability to empower IGs and hold them accountable. With that, I recognize Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I value any attempt to protect taxpayers from potential waste, fraud, and abuse by strengthening the suspension and debarment process. For that reason, I support the Suspend Act. I also commend you on the bipartisan approach to developing this legislation, and am happy to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. Our committee, under former Chairman Henry Waxman, spent a significant amount of time investigating government contractors that continued receiving taxpayer funds despite evidence of criminal activity, fraud, and overcharging. We also investigated a deficient suspension and debarment process that too often allowed agencies to reward contractors that had not served the taxpayers well. Although this oversight helped shine a light on these troublesome practices, a report issued by the GAO in 2011 found that some agencies have failed for years to suspend or debar a single individual or business. And a 2012 report by the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee confirmed that persistent weaknesses remain throughout various agencies. The Suspend Act is designed to rectify these weaknesses by consolidating approximately 45 agency and government corporations S&D offices into one centralized board. The board would consolidate staffing and administrative resources and ensure consistent standards and procedures for all alleged violators. The board would also serve as the central point of authority and accountability while also employing a transparent case management system. The goal of this bill is not to punish contractors, but to protect taxpayers. Taxpayers deserve to know that Federal contracts and grants are not awarded to those who have acted dishonestly, irresponsibly, or incompetently. Having the powerful tools of suspension and debarment does little if they are not going to be used effectively. The GAO report found that civilian agencies with the highest number of suspensions and debarments share certain characteristics. First, they dedicate staff full-time to the suspension and debarment process. Second, they have detailed guidance in place. And finally, they have a robust case referral process. This legislation requires agencies to satisfy all of these requirements. This bill also allows agencies that are currently performing suspension and debarment activities effectively to continue those activities by obtaining an OMB waiver. Most Cabinet-level agencies are in this category. The waiver is applicable for 5 years and may be renewed indefinitely as long as they demonstrate what GAO considers the key characteristics of effective suspension and debarment programs. One of our most important jobs here in Congress is to guard against unnecessary spending and make sure that we are doing everything in our power to protect taxpayer funds. I believe this bill will advance those goals. Today's markup is an early but important step towards improving the current system, and I look forward to working with the Administration to improve and refine this legislation as we move forward. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll hold the record open to the end of the day for any members who wish to submit additional written statements. Does any member further wish to speak on the bill? Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Chairman?
You're a little premature, perhaps by a couple of generations. Does the gentleman from Utah wish to offer the Chaffetz-Speer-Tierney amendment at this time?
Yes, I do.
The gentleman is recognized. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3345, Stop Unworthy Spending Act, offered by Mr. Chaffetz of Utah.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Chairman, and I also thank Ms. Speer and Mr. Tierney, who I've worked closely with, and their staff. We appreciate the good efforts in coming up with this amendment that we offer to the body today. It has to do with the suspension and debarment and making sure that these are dealt with in a timely manner. One of our deep concerns, I think, is that sometimes these referrals are made and they're not dealt with in a timely manner, particularly as we deal with overseas. We have seen cases, a number of cases, where the Inspector General has believed, particularly in the case of Afghanistan, that funds were given to the Taliban, and that these people continued to were given contracts and it was not dealt with in a timely manner. So specifically, the amendment provides a 30-day time limit for the referred cases to be either accepted or rejected by the suspension and debarment official. If additional information is needed, the agency official or the IG who prepared the case must be notified. It also requires all suspension and debarment cases to be resolved within 6 months from the initial referral date. The agency official or the IG who have prepared the case file will be notified of any cases unresolved within that time frame and be updated every 3 months until the final resolution of the case. The amendment also requires that the annual report to Congress include the number and summary of instances where the agency had made determinations to override suspension and debarment decisions and allow a suspended or debarred entity from receiving new contracts or grants. This, again, I think will be very informative to the Congress as we review this to make sure that we deal with this very important topic. There's nothing worse that we see in the Federal Government when our taxpayer dollars are wasted and abused. And again, I appreciate Ms. Speer and Mr. Tierney working with us in offering this bipartisan amendment. We urge adoption. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And to my colleague, Mr. Chaffetz, I want to really compliment the Chair on recognizing a very important role for this committee to engage in terms of the suspension and disbarment issue. Just for purposes of making a comment about the title, unworthy has a value judgment associated with it. We might want to use the word unjustified, but that's for the wordsmithers to use and contemplate. To add to Mr. Chaffetz's comments, what we have found is that when suspension and debarment has been used historically, it's been voluntary, which has been in some respects laughable. Too many of the decisions have been made behind closed doors, and that creates a problem when there's not transparency. This year in the Armed Services Committee and the NDA, I was able to get a requirement that the Department make any waivers from a suspension or debarment decision public. The Suspend Act will now require this for all agencies to publicly disclose, and I think that is critical. But another issue that we are going to have to confront is the fact that waivers are commonplace, and companies are oftentimes found to be too big to debar, and fines have been so small that they seem as simply being a cost of doing business with the Federal Government. It's important to me that agencies should not be granted waivers from suspension and debarment board unless they truly have a system in place to hold contractors accountable. And so this particular amendment will make sure that the GAO verifies that the waiver is in fact authorized by determining whether or not they have a legitimate suspension and debarment process in effect. But over the long term, I think we've got to drill down even further to see to what extent these fines are merely slaps on the hand, and that the same contractors, even though they've engaged in egregious behavior, continue to get Federal contracts. With that, I yield back.
Would the gentlelady, well, never mind, the gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment. Mr. Chaffetz, Ms. Speier, Mr. Tierney, this is a good amendment. And quite frankly, I think that all of us who have lived through the years of the Afghan and Iraq wars recognize that timely decisions have been one of the challenges, particularly in war. Often we think of the suspension debarment as, oh, it's going to take a long time, but that's probably okay. It's part of government. But I know Ms. Speier and I know Mr. Chaffetz as Chairman of the National Security Subcommittee, all have seen that, in fact, we have to act quickly. When we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on sole source contracts and billions of dollars a month in combat, all it takes is one bad actor that continues for even a short period of time, and we have wasted countless dollars, and I fear on occasions countless lives that can be lost if a contractor is not performing. This committee has considered and looked at oversight under both the Bush administration and the Obama administration in which contractors have conducted themselves in ways that fully deserve to be debarred, and yet it has been a slow process. Mr. Cummings, I think, made a good point in talking about the contribution made under Chairman Waxman. I vividly remember a hearing some years ago in which it was discovered that a contractor had sold us 1970s ammunition, bought surplus from the Eastern Bloc, to be delivered to, I believe it was in Afghanistan. And, of course, that material was so old as to possibly cause loss of life. You cannot have ammunition from the 1970s and have the same likelihood that it's going to be reliable. So I think for all of us who do this today, we should consider that this is not only the amendment, which shortens and defines the time, but the underlying bill brings us to a point where we're trying to hold our government accountable, not just for financial reasons, but for reasons of life and death that we've often asked men and women of the armed forces to face as they've gone forward in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I fear in the days to come will continue to do so. And with that, I recommend support for the amendment and yield back. I recognize the ranking member for his statement.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with what you just said. You know, there are two issues here, as I see it. One, I think it's important that we address these issues so that whatever justice needs to take place takes place rapidly, so we don't have people sort of waiting out the clock and at the same time being a bad actor. And the other thing, too, is I think it's important for the contractor to get a disposition of whatever maybe, you know, the case, whatever the case may be. In other words, to get to be, if he's not going to be debarred, that's one thing. If he's going to be debarred, that's a whole other thing. So that they can act accordingly, because in many instances, of course, they have a lot of employees and they're trying to make decisions. So I just think it's a good amendment all around. It's a good bill, and so I support the amendment in the bill.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. If there is no further members seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Utah and the gentlelady from California. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If there is no further discussion, I now move that the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 3345 as amended with the recommendation that it do pass. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 3345 to the House as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 3345, the Suspend Act, is ordered reported to the House as amended. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make technical and conforming changes without objection, so ordered. The question is on agreeing to the amendment to H.R. 33, or I now call back up H.R. 3316. The question is on agreeing to the amendment to H.R. 3316, the Grant Act offered by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, or no. Sorry. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
You're asking for a recorded vote?
Again, I would request a recorded vote.
The gentleman demands a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Mica? No. Mr. Mica votes no. Mr. Turner? Mr. Duncan? Mr. McHenry? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Lankford? Mr. Lankford votes no. Mr. Amash? Dr. Gosar? Mr. Meehan? Dr. Desjarlais? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Lummis? Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Collins? Mr. Meadows? Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Norton? I'm sorry, Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes aye. Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan votes aye. Mrs. Duckworth? Mrs. Duckworth votes aye. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Horsford? Ms. Luann Grisham? Ms. Luann Grisham votes aye.
Any additional members? Mr. Farenthold?
Mr. Farenthold votes no.
Mr. McHenry?
Mr. McHenry?
Mr. Jordan?
Mr. Jordan votes no.
Any additional members? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Meadows?
Mr. Meadows votes
Mr.
no.
DeSantis?
Hang on.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Desjarlais? Any additional members wish to be recorded? Mr. Turner, do you want to know how you're recorded?
You are not, sir? No. Mr. Turner votes no.
Mr. Collins, are you recorded? The gentleman is recorded?
Mr. Collins, you are not recorded? Mr. Collins votes no.
Mr. Massey?
You are not recorded. You are recorded no.
Mr. Amash?
Mr. Amash votes no.
Mr. Clay, I don't have you recorded. Do you wish to be recorded?
Mr. Clay votes aye. to go by your numbers. Go ahead.
The clerk will call the roll. I mean, sorry, the clerk will designate.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, 15 ayes, 18 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on I now move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 3316 to the House with the recommendation it do pass as amended. The question is on favorable reporting H.R. 3316 to the House as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Chairman.
Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes,
Chairman.
I'm sorry, I'll get you in a second. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Does the gentleman request a recorded vote?
Yes.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa.
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Mica. Mr. Mica votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz. Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Walberg. Mr. Walberg votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Amash. Mr. Amash votes aye. Dr. Gosar. Mr. Meehan. Dr. Desjarlais. Dr. Desjarlais votes aye. Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Farenthold. Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Lummis. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Bentivolio. Mr. Bentivolio votes aye. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Cummings.
No.
Mr. Cummings votes no. Mrs. Maloney.
No.
Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mrs. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Tierney. No. Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch. No. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Connolly.
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan votes no. Mrs. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Welch. Mr. Cardenas. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Horsford. Ms. Lujan Grisham. Ms. Lujan Grisham votes no.
Really, the only reason that we didn't lock anyone out, they were in the meeting yesterday, but after the CGI meeting where we said what we were told, you guys said, quite frankly, that we were mischaracterizing. We weren't. You know, we never said the White House. But we said they reported, they were told by CMS and HHS people that the White House had directed.
Mike.
The clerk will report.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, 19 ayes, 15 noes.
The H.R. 3316, the Grant Act, is approved and reported to the House as amended. I now ask unanimous consent that staff be allowed to make technical and conforming changes without objection so ordered. And with that, I thank all of you on both sides, and we stand adjourned.